The breakfast tray hit the floor with a loud crash. Scrambled eggs, toast, and tea spread across the concrete in a mess of yellow, brown, and liquid. Every inmate in the dining hall at Parkhurst Prison turned to look. Some were hoping for violence. Others were just grateful for any entertainment in the monotony of prison life. It was March 8th, 1976. Reggie Kray had been in prison for 7 years, serving a life sentence for murder. He was 42 years old, kept in shape through constant exercise, and despite the circumstances, maintained the same dignified demeanor he'd had on the outside. He wore his prison uniform like it was a tailored suit, kept his hair neat, carried himself with the pride of someone who knew he was still Reggie Kray, even behind bars. The guard who'd knocked the tray from Reggie's hands was named William Billy Thompson. He was 38 years old, had worked at Parkhurst for 12 years, and had a reputation for being a bully. Billy enjoyed having power over men who'd once been powerful. Enjoyed reminding them they were prisoners now, nobodies, just numbers in the system. "Pick it up," Billy said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "You dropped your breakfast. Clean it up. Now." Reggie looked at the mess on the floor, then looked up at Billy and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a fake smile, a genuine, calm smile. The same smile he'd used before destroying Tommy Morrison in the street. The smile that people who knew him had learned to fear. "You knocked it out of my hands," Reggie said quietly. "So you clean it up." The dining hall went completely silent. Every conversation stopped. Every inmate turned to watch. Because what Reggie had just said was unthinkable. Prisoners didn't talk back to guards, didn't refuse direct orders, didn't challenge authority. That's how you ended up in solitary confinement. Or worse. Billy's face turned red. "What did you just say to me?" "I said you knocked my breakfast out of my hands, so you clean it up. Not your servant. I'm not your dog. I'm a prisoner, yes, but I'm still Reggie Kray, and I don't clean up messes I didn't make." This is the story of what happened when a prison guard tried to humiliate Reggie Kray in front of the entire prison population. The story of how Reggie responded, not with immediate violence, but with something more calculated, more devastating, and more permanent. And the story of why, 3 months later, Billy Thompson would beg for a transfer to a different prison, terrified for his life, despite being surrounded by guards and security. Billy Thompson had been planning this confrontation for weeks. He'd watched Reggie Kray move through the prison with the same confidence he'd had as a mob boss in London, watched other inmates show him respect, watched him maintain his dignity despite being locked up. And it irritated Billy. He believed that prisoners, especially famous ones like Reggie Kray, needed to be broken, needed to understand they were nothing anymore, that their reputation, their past, their pride meant nothing inside prison walls. So Billy had been looking for an opportunity, a moment when he could publicly humiliate Reggie, make him look weak, show the other prisoners that even Reggie Kray could be reduced to nothing. The breakfast tray had been that opportunity. Now, standing in the silent dining hall with every inmate watching, Billy had to make a choice. He could back down, admit he'd knocked the tray deliberately, apologize, walk away. That would be the smart move, the de-escalating move. Or he could double down, assert his authority, show Reggie and everyone else who really had power in this place. Billy chose to double down. "You refusing a direct order?" Billy said. "That's insubordination. That's time in solitary. That's more charges added to your sentence. Now pick up that mess before I make this worse for you." Reggie remained sitting. The smile never left his face. "No." "Last chance, Kray. Pick it up." "No." Billy grabbed Reggie by the arm, tried to yank him to his feet. But Reggie was strong. All those years of training, even in prison. Billy couldn't budge him. That's when 3 more guards rushed over. They grabbed Reggie, lifted him from his seat, forced him to his knees in front of the spilled breakfast. "Clean it up," Billy ordered. "With your hands, like the animal you are." Still, Reggie refused. Just knelt there, looking up at Billy, smiling. "Fine," Billy said. "Solitary confinement. 30 days. Maybe that'll teach you some respect." The guards dragged Reggie away. He didn't resist. Just let them take him. That same calm smile on his face. Like he knew something Billy didn't. Like this was all going according to a plan Billy couldn't see. Solitary confinement at Parkhurst was brutal. A small cell. No windows, no contact with other prisoners. 1 hour of exercise daily in a small yard. The rest of the time, just you and your thoughts. Most prisoners went crazy after a few days. Started talking to themselves. Hallucinating. Breaking down psychologically. The isolation was designed to be punishing. Designed to break you. But Reggie had been preparing for this possibility since the day he arrived at Parkhurst. He'd known that eventually a guard would try something, would push too far, would create a situation where Reggie would have to respond. So Reggie had planned, thought about what he'd do if a guard tried to humiliate him, how he'd respond, what tools he had available even in the restricted environment of maximum security prison. The answer was simple: information and influence. Reggie had spent 7 years building relationships in Parkhurst. Not just with other prisoners, though he had plenty of those, but with certain guards who could be corrupted, who wanted money, who had gambling debts, or drinking problems, or financial difficulties, who could be convinced to do small favors for the right price. Reggie also had resources on the outside. His twin, brother Ronald, was in a different prison, but could make phone calls. Friends and associates from the old days were still loyal. Money was still available. The Kray organization might be dismantled, but the network of people who owed the Krays favors still existed. During his first week in solitary, Reggie thought about Billy Thompson, about what made Billy vulnerable, about how to hurt him without using violence, because violence would be expected, would be defended against, would result in more punishment for Reggie. No, This required something different, something psychological, something that would destroy Billy's sense of security without Reggie ever laying a hand on him. By the end of his first week in solitary, Reggie had a plan. Reggie sent word to his brother Ronald through a system they'd developed. Coded messages passed through visiting family members. The message was simple. Find out everything about prison guard William Thompson at Parkhurst. Everything. Ronald got the message. Made some calls, put some people to work. Within 2 weeks, Ronald's people had compiled a comprehensive file on Billy Thompson. Personal information. Married to a woman named Sarah. 2 children, ages 9 and 12. Lived in a semi-detached house in Newport, about 40 miles from Parkhurst. Drove a 10-year-old Ford. Salary was decent, but not great, about £8,000 annually. Financial situation. Billy had debts, gambling debts specifically. He liked betting on horses, wasn't very good at it, owed approximately £3,000 to various bookmakers, roughly 4 months of his salary. Vulnerabilities. Billy's wife didn't know about the gambling debts. He'd been hiding them from her, making minimum payments, struggling to keep up. The stress was affecting his marriage. Sarah had noticed Billy was irritable, distant, drinking more than usual. Associates. Billy had a brother named Frank, who was also a prison guard at a different facility. The brothers were close. Billy also had a friend named Gary, who worked as a prison guard at Parkhurst. They'd started the job around the same time, often worked the same shifts. This information was gold. Ronald sent it back to Reggie through the same coded system. When Reggie received this information, in his 3rd week of solitary confinement, he smiled. The same smile he'd used in the dining hall. The smile that meant he'd found his angle. On Reggie's 28th day in solitary confinement, 2 days before his scheduled release back into general population, Billy Thompson received a phone call at home. It was 10 p.m., after his shift at the prison. "Mr. Thompson?" an unfamiliar voice said. "Yes." "Who's this?" "A friend. I'm calling to let you know that we're aware of your financial situation, the gambling debts, the £3,000 you owe, the fact that your wife doesn't know about it." Billy's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "Like I said, a friend. And friends help each other. We can make your debt go away." All £3,000 paid off. Clean slate. Your wife never has to know. Why would you do that? Because we want something small in return. A favor. Nothing illegal, nothing dangerous. Just a small favor. What favor? We'll let you know soon. For now, just know that your debt is being handled. You'll get a call from your bookmakers in the next few days. They'll confirm that your balance is 0. Consider it a gift. No strings attached. Yet. The line went dead. Billy sat there, phone in hand, shaking. Someone knew about his debts, knew about his secret, knew where he lived. And they'd called him at home, after hours, making it clear they could reach him anywhere. 3 days later, Billy's primary bookmaker called him. "Hey, Billy, good news. Someone paid off your account. $3,000. Completely cleared. Don't know who Don't know why, but you're square with us." Billy felt relief and terror simultaneously. Relief that the crushing debt was gone. Terror about what he'd have to do to pay it back. Reggie Kray was released from solitary confinement on April 7th, 1976, exactly 30 days after being sent there. He walked back into general population, looking the same as he had going in. Calm, composed, dignified. Other prisoners welcomed him back, asked if he was okay, expressed respect for how he'd handled Billy Thompson. Word had spread throughout the prison about the confrontation, about how Reggie had refused to be humiliated, about how he'd been dragged to solitary, still smiling. Billy Thompson saw Reggie return to general population, watched him walk through the common area, surrounded by other inmates who clearly respected him. And Billy wondered, was Reggie behind the phone call, behind the debt being paid off? He didn't have to wonder long. 2 days after Reggie's return, Billy received another phone call at home. Same unfamiliar voice. "Mr. Thompson, time to discuss that favor. What do you want?" Nothing dramatic. Just this. Stop harassing Reggie. Kray, don't seek him out. Don't create problems for him. Don't try to humiliate him again. Just treat him like any other prisoner. Fair treatment. Nothing more, nothing less. That's it? That's the favor? That's it. Simple, right? You stop being a bully to one specific prisoner, and we consider your debt paid. Billy was quiet. And if I don't, then we make another call. This one to your wife. We tell her about the gambling, about the debts, about how close you came to losing everything. We show her the records, the betting slips, everything. Your marriage ends. Your kids grow up in a broken home, all because you couldn't stop picking on one prisoner. Is that worth it? Billy closed his eyes. I'll leave him alone. Smart choice. We'll be watching. Remember that. The line went dead. After that phone call, Billy Thompson's behavior toward Reggie Kray changed completely. He stopped making eye contact with Reggie, avoided being on the same shifts when he had to interact with Reggie during counts, during meal times. He was scrupulously professional. No harassment, no bullying, no attempts at humiliation. Other guards noticed. Other prisoners noticed. And everyone drew the same conclusion. Somehow Reggie Kray had gotten to Billy Thompson, had figured out a way to neutralize him, had won without using violence. But Billy's troubles weren't settled, because now other prisoners saw that Billy could be intimidated, saw that he was vulnerable, and they started testing him. A prisoner would refuse an order. Billy would back down instead of enforcing it. Another prisoner would talk back. Billy would ignore it instead of punishing it. Billy's authority was eroding. His reputation as a tough, no-nonsense guard was gone, replaced by the image of someone who could be broken. By May 1976, Billy was having panic attacks before shifts, was drinking heavily after work, was seeing shadows where there weren't any, was terrified that some associate of the Krays, was watching his house, following his family, waiting for him to make a mistake. His wife, Sarah, noticed something's wrong. "Billy, what's going on? You're different, distant, scared. Talk to me." "I can't," Billy said. "I just need to get through this. Get through each day." In June 1976, Billy Thompson requested a transfer to a different prison. Told his supervisors he needed a change of environment. The transfer was approved for September. But 3 months felt like an eternity to Billy. 3 months of working in the same prison as Reggie Kray. 3 months of seeing that knowing smile every time their paths crossed. 3 months of wondering if today would be the day someone decided to hurt him. On September 15th, 1976, Billy Thompson worked his last shift at Parkhurst Prison. He was transferring to Albany Prison on the Isle of Wight, still a maximum security facility, but one without Reggie Kray. On his final day, Billy was walking through a corridor when he encountered Reggie. They were alone, just the two of them. No other guards, no other prisoners. Billy froze. This was his nightmare scenario. Alone with Reggie Kray. Vulnerable. But Reggie didn't attack him, didn't threaten him, just stopped walking and looked at Billy calmly. "I heard you're transferring," Reggie said. "Yes. Tomorrow." "Good. Fresh start. That's good." Billy didn't say anything, just stood there, waiting for whatever was coming. "You know why this happened to you?" Reggie asked. "Why you went from confident to terrified in 6 months?" "Because I humiliated you." "No, because you tried to break me. You saw me maintaining my dignity, and it bothered you. You thought that by humiliating me in front of other prisoners, you'd show everyone that reputation doesn't matter. That past power doesn't matter. That in here, you're in charge. But you forgot something. Dignity isn't about circumstances. It's about who you are. You can take away my freedom. You can lock me in a cell. You can put me in solitary confinement. But you can't take away who I am. Can't make me less than myself. That's the lesson you learned these past 6 months. And here's the thing. I never wanted to hurt you. Never wanted to destroy you. All I wanted was for you to treat me with basic respect. Like a human being. Not like an animal you could abuse. If you'd done that from the beginning, none of this would have happened. Billy found his voice. You ruined my life. No, I changed your behavior. Your life is fine. Your debt is paid. Your wife still doesn't know. Your job is secure. You're just scared now. Scared of what could happen if you go back to being a bully. That fear, that's what's going to make you a better prison guard, better person. You're going to treat prisoners with respect now. Not because you like them, but because you're afraid of what might happen if you don't. And honestly, that's good enough. Reggie walked away, leaving Billy standing in the corridor. Billy Thompson spent the rest of his career as a prison guard at Albany Prison. He retired in 1994 after 32 years in the prison service. Never had another major incident. Never bullied another prisoner. Treated everyone with professional distance and basic respect. His wife, Sarah, never learned about the gambling debts or what happened with Reggie Kray. Billy's marriage survived. His kids grew up normal. He lived a quiet life. But he never forgot those 6 months in 1976. Never forgot the feeling of being utterly powerless, despite being the one with authority. Never forgot Reggie Kray's smile in the dining hall, the smile that had predicted everything that would happen next. Reggie Kray remained at Parkhurst Prison until 1979, when he was transferred to other facilities. He was finally released in 2000, just weeks before his death from cancer. He spent 31 years in prison total. In a 1998 interview, Reggie was asked about the incident with Billy Thompson. That was one of the most satisfying things I did in prison. Not because I hurt him, I didn't, but because I taught him something. Taught him that power isn't about position or authority. It's about understanding people, finding their vulnerabilities, using information instead of violence. Billy thought he had power because he wore a uniform, because he had keys, because he could punish prisoners. But real power is making someone change their behavior without ever touching them. That's what I did. And Billy learned the lesson, became a better guard because of it. In a strange way, I did him a favor. Do you regret it? What you put him through? Reggie thought for a moment. No. He earned it. He tried to break me, tried to humiliate me in front of the entire prison. That required a response. I could have had him beaten. That would have been easy to arrange. But that would have made me no better than him. Instead, I made him afraid, made him understand what it feels like to be powerless. That was better, more educational, more permanent. The story of Reggie Kray and Billy Thompson became legendary in British prisons. A story about what happens when someone tries to break an unbreakable man. About the difference between authority and power. About how intelligence beats position. And whenever the story was told, people always mentioned the smile. That calm, knowing smile Reggie had in the dining hall right after Billy knocked his breakfast tray to the floor. The smile that said, "You just made a terrible mistake. You don't know it yet. But you will." That smile haunted Billy Thompson for the rest of his life. Appeared in his dreams sometimes. A reminder that some people like Reggie Kray, carry their power inside themselves. And no amount of external authority can take that away. Prison guard William Thompson tried to humiliate Reggie Kray. Reggie smiled, then systematically destroyed Billy's sense of security without ever using violence. Just information. Just pressure. Just fear. And that was worse than any beating could have been. That wraps it up for today. March 1976. Parkhurst Prison. Guard Billy Thompson knocked Reggie Kray's breakfast tray to the floor. Demanded Reggie clean it up like an animal. Reggie refused. Smiled. Got dragged to solitary. 30 days. But during those 30 days, Reggie's people investigated Billy. Found his gambling debts, paid them off, then called Billy at home. Made it clear. Leave Reggie alone, or your wife learns everything. Billy's confidence shattered. His authority evaporated. 3 months later, he begged for a transfer. Spent the rest of his career terrified. Because Billy learned the hard way. You don't humiliate Reggie Kray. Ever. Even in prison. Especially in prison. If this story amazed you, drop a comment below. Subscribe for more stories where intelligence beats authority. See you in the next one. The exercise yard at Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight was crowded on the afternoon of March 23, 1976. About 60 prisoners were outside during the daily 2-hour recreation period. Some walked the perimeter. Some lifted weights in the makeshift gym area. Some stood in groups, talking, smoking, passing time. Parkhurst was a Category A prison, housing some of Britain's most dangerous criminals. Murderers, armed robbers, gangsters, men who'd committed serious violence on the outside and continued that violence on the inside. Among them was Reginald Kray, 42 years old, 7 years into a life sentence for murder. Reggie had been convicted in 1969 for killing Jack the Hat McVitie and running an organized crime empire with his twin brother Ronald. The Kray twins were the most famous criminals in Britain. Their trial had been a media sensation. Their sentencing had made headlines around the world. And in prison, they remained celebrities, respected, feared, untouchable in the prison hierarchy. Also in the yard that day was a man named Thomas Big Tom Morrison. Tom was massive, 6 feet 5 inches tall, 320 pounds, a former enforcer for a gang in South London, convicted of multiple violent assaults. Tom had a reputation in Parkhurst for being tough, for not backing down, for using his size to intimidate other prisoners. Tom had been at Parkhurst for 3 years, had established himself as someone you didn't mess with, and Tom had a problem with the Kray twins. Resented their celebrity status. Resented that other prisoners treated them with deference. Resented that someone who was only 5'8" and maybe 165 pounds commanded more respect than Tom, who could physically dominate most men. So on March 23, 1976, at approximately 2:45 p.m., Big Tom Morrison made a decision that would change his life. He walked over to where Reggie Kray was standing, and he said something about Violet Kray, Reggie's mother. Something disrespectful, something insulting, something that every prisoner within earshot knew was a death sentence. This is the story of what happened in the 15 seconds after Big Tom insulted Reggie Kray's mother. The story of how a 320-pound enforcer learned that size means nothing against a man who grew up street fighting in East London and who would kill to defend his mother's honor. And the story of why, after that day, no prisoner in Parkhurst ever made the mistake of disrespecting the Kray name again. Because Reggie Kray proved something in those 15 seconds that became legend throughout Britain's prison system. You never, ever insult a Kray twin's mother. Not if you want to remain conscious. To understand what happened in that exercise yard, you need to understand prison hierarchy in 1970s Britain, particularly at Parkhurst. Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight was opened in 1838. By the 1970s, it housed approximately 500 of Britain's most dangerous criminals. Category A prisoners. men serving life sentences for murder, men who'd escaped from other prisons, men considered too dangerous for standard facilities. In prison, a hierarchy exists that's separate from the official institutional structure. Guards and administrators run the prison officially. But among prisoners, different rules apply. Respect is earned through reputation, violence, connections, and most importantly, through demonstrated willingness to defend your status. At the top of Parkhurst's prisoner hierarchy, in 1976 were the Kray twins. Reggie and Ronnie had been at Parkhurst since 1972, when they were transferred from other facilities. Their reputation from the outside followed them inside. Everyone knew who they were, what they'd done, the empire they'd built in London, the murders they'd committed. But prison reputation isn't just about what you did on the outside. It's about how you conduct yourself inside. Do you back down from confrontations? Do you allow disrespect? Do you maintain the standards that made you dangerous on the streets? The Kray twins maintained those standards absolutely. They didn't start fights unnecessarily, didn't bully weaker prisoners, but they also never backed down, never allowed disrespect, and never, under any circumstances, allowed anyone to disrespect their mother. Violet Kray was sacred to both twins. She visited regularly, brought them home-cooked food, wrote letters constantly. The twins' love for their mother was well known, and smart prisoners understood that mentioning Violet Kray in any negative context was suicide. Big Tom Morrison was not a smart prisoner. Thomas Morrison was born in 1941 in Brixton, South London. Grew up poor, large from childhood. By his teenage years, Tom was already over 6 feet tall and 250 pounds. Used his size to dominate other kids. Got into constant fights. By his 20s, Tom was working as an enforcer for various South London gangs. His specialty was intimidation, collections, beatings. He wasn't sophisticated, wasn't strategic, just big and willing to hurt people. That was enough to make him valuable to criminal organizations that needed muscle. Tom was convicted in 1971 of assault causing grievous bodily harm. He'd beaten a man so severely that the victim spent 2 months in hospital with a broken jaw, shattered cheekbone, and brain trauma. Tom received a 15-year sentence, was sent to Parkhurst in 1973. At Parkhurst, Tom established himself through violence, beat up several prisoners who challenged him, used his size to take commissary items from weaker inmates, built a reputation as someone you didn't mess with unless you wanted a trip to the prison hospital. But Tom had a fundamental misunderstanding about prison violence. He thought size was what mattered. Thought being the biggest, strongest man in a room meant you were the most dangerous. He didn't understand that in prison, especially in a place like Parkhurst, filled with killers and gangsters. Size meant nothing compared to skill, reputation, and willingness to do whatever was necessary. Tom also had resentment issues. He resented that the Kray twins, despite being smaller than him, commanded more respect. Resented that other prisoners deferred to them. Resented that Tom's size and strength didn't give him the status he thought he deserved. In March 1976, that resentment finally overrode Tom's limited common sense, and he made a decision that would cost him dearly. The confrontation on March 23, 1976, didn't come from nowhere. There'd been tension between Tom Morrison and the Kray twins for weeks. It started in early March when Tom made a comment in the dining hall, loud enough for multiple prisoners to hear. "The Krays! Everyone acts like they're royalty. They're just two small guys who got lucky on the outside. In here, they're nothing special." Word of the comment reached Reggie within hours. Everything that happens in prison reaches everyone else quickly. Reggie didn't respond directly, didn't confront Tom, just filed the information away, noted that Tom was testing boundaries. A week later, Tom did it again, this time in the library. Made a comment about how the Krays got special treatment, how guards let them have visitors whenever they wanted, how they got better food. "Prison royalty," Tom said mockingly, "like they're special." Again, Reggie didn't respond. But other prisoners were watching, wondering if the Krays had gone soft, wondering if Reggie would let this challenge to his status continue unanswered. Then, on March 23rd, Tom escalated. In the exercise yard, in front of dozens of witnesses. Tom walked over to where Reggie was standing with two other prisoners, said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I heard your mum was here visiting yesterday, bringing you food like you're still a little boy. Must be nice having Mummy take care of you. Even in prison, you need your mummy." The yard went quiet. Prisoners within earshot stopped what they were doing, because everyone knew. You don't talk about Violet Kray. You don't insult her. You don't even mention her in a disrespectful context. That was the line you never crossed with the Kray twins. Reggie turned slowly to face Tom. His expression didn't change, didn't show anger, didn't show emotion. Just looked at Tom with complete focus. "What did you just say?" Tom, emboldened by the audience and his size advantage, repeated it. "I said you're a mummy's boy, even in prison. 42 years old, and still need your mummy to bring you food. Pathetic." Reggie smiled, the same dangerous smile that people who knew him had learned to fear. "You got one chance to take that back, to apologize. Right now, or I'm going to hurt you very badly." Tom laughed, looked around at the other prisoners watching. "You? You're going to hurt me? Look at you. You're tiny. I could break you in half." "Last chance," Reggie said quietly. "Apologize." Tom took a step closer to Reggie, using his size to intimidate, towering over Reggie. "I don't apologize to Mummy's boys." That was the last thing Tom said before Reggie moved. What happened next lasted approximately 15 seconds, maybe 20. But to everyone watching, it seemed both faster and longer. Faster because Reggie's movements were so quick that witnesses later disagreed about the sequence. Longer because the violence was so comprehensive that it felt like it should have taken more time than it actually did. Reggie's first move was a punch to Tom's solar plexus, below the ribs, a spot that causes the diaphragm to spasm and breathing to stop momentarily. The punch was perfectly placed, delivered with full body weight behind it, despite Reggie being 8 inches shorter than Tom. Tom's breath exploded out of him. He doubled over reflexively. His guard dropped. Reggie followed immediately with an uppercut to Tom's chin. Reggie had been an amateur boxer in his youth, had won multiple titles, still trained regularly in prison. The uppercut snapped Tom's head back. Tom's legs went weak. Tom tried to grab Reggie, to use his size advantage, to wrap Reggie up and use his strength. But Reggie sidestepped, delivered 2 quick body shots to Tom's kidneys. Precise. Professional. The kind of punches that don't look devastating, but cause enormous internal pain. Tom swung wildly. A haymaker that would have knocked Reggie unconscious if it had connected. But Reggie slipped under the punch, countered with a hook to Tom's liver. The liver shot was the beginning of the end. The liver is one of the most painful places to be hit. Tom's legs buckled completely. He dropped to one knee, gasping, trying to breathe. Reggie didn't stop, delivered a knee strike to Tom's face, broke Tom's nose, blood immediately pouring down Tom's chin. Tom fell forward onto his hands, on all fours now, completely defensive, no longer attacking, just trying to protect himself. Reggie grabbed Tom's head, pulled it up, looked Tom in the eyes, said clearly enough that prisoners 20 feet away could hear, "You don't talk about my mother, ever, you understand?" Tom nodded weakly, blood running down his face, barely conscious. Reggie released Tom's head, let him fall face first onto the concrete, turned and walked away. The entire fight had lasted 15 seconds, maybe 20. Tom Morrison, 320 pounds, 6'5", a man who'd built his reputation on size and intimidation, was lying on the ground, bleeding, broken, destroyed by a man 8 inches shorter and 150 pounds lighter. Guards rushed into the exercise yard, saw Tom on the ground, saw Reggie walking away, saw 60 prisoners standing around, watching silently. "What happened?" the senior guard demanded. No one answered. Not one of the 60 witnesses. Not even the prisoners who'd been standing right next to the fight. Because this was prison business. You don't talk to guards about prison business. Not if you want to survive. The guards took Tom to the prison hospital. He had a broken nose, fractured jaw, severe bruising to his torso and face, and mild concussion. He'd need medical treatment, stitches, pain medication, would be in the hospital wing for at least a week. The guards also took Reggie to solitary confinement, standard procedure after a fight. They couldn't prove Reggie had attacked Tom. None of the witnesses would confirm it, but Reggie's knuckles were scraped, and Tom had obviously been beaten. Reggie was placed in solitary for 30 days, pending investigation. Reggie didn't resist, didn't complain, just went to solitary quietly, because he'd accomplished what he needed to accomplish. He'd sent a message, not just to Tom, but to every prisoner at Parkhurst. The Kray name commanded respect. Insult that name, especially insult Violet Kray, and there were immediate, violent consequences. Size didn't matter. Numbers didn't matter. Reputation was everything. Tom Morrison spent 7 days in the prison hospital. His physical injuries healed over several weeks. Broken nose. Fractured jaw that had to be wired shut. Ribs that were badly bruised, though not broken. Extensive bruising throughout his torso. But Tom's reputation never recovered. The damage to his status in Parkhurst's prisoner hierarchy was permanent. Before the fight, Tom had been feared, respected for his size and willingness to use violence. Other prisoners avoided confronting him, gave him space, acknowledged his status. After the fight, Tom was a joke. Prisoners openly mocked him. "Big Tom? Yeah, he's big. Big enough to get knocked out by someone a foot shorter than him. Big enough to get destroyed in 15 seconds. The story spread throughout Parkhurst within hours, then spread to other prisons through prisoner transfers and letters. Within months, everyone in Britain's prison system knew. Big Tom Morrison had insulted Reggie Kray's mother, and Reggie had destroyed him in seconds. Tom tried to rebuild his reputation, got into fights with other prisoners, won some through sheer size, but he could never escape the stigma, never regain the status he'd had before challenging Reggie. In 1978, Tom was transferred to a different prison, partly for his own safety, partly because his presence at Parkhurst had become a constant reminder of what happens when you disrespect the Krays. He served the remainder of his sentence at multiple facilities, was released in 1986 after 15 years total. Tom Morrison died in 1999 at age 58 from liver cirrhosis. Alcoholic, broke, forgotten by everyone except as a cautionary tale in prison lore. The man who challenged Reggie Kray and learned in 15 seconds that size means nothing against skill, experience, and absolute willingness to defend family honor. Reggie spent 30 days in solitary confinement, standard punishment for fighting. Guards questioned him repeatedly about what had happened. Reggie's response never varied. "I was walking in the yard. Tom Morrison fell down. I don't know what happened to him. Maybe he tripped." The guards knew Reggie was lying. But without witnesses willing to testify, without video evidence, they couldn't prove anything. They released Reggie from solitary after 30 days. Reggie returned to general population. When he walked into the common area, prisoners applauded. Not openly. That would have been too obvious to guards. But quietly. A slow clap that acknowledged what Reggie had done. That recognized his defense of his mother's honor. That confirmed his status at the top of Parkhurst's hierarchy. For Reggie, the 30 days in solitary was worth it. The fight with Tom had accomplished multiple things. Defended his mother's honor, the most important goal. No one would insult Violet Kray again. Not in Reggie's presence. Not anywhere word could get back to him. Re-established dominance. Tom's weeks of testing boundaries had challenged Reggie's status. The fight ended that challenge definitively. No one would question the Kray's position again. Demonstrated skill over size. The fight showed that Reggie, despite being smaller than many prisoners, was more dangerous than bigger men. That his boxing training, his street fighting experience, his absolute focus made him unbeatable in the kind of short, brutal confrontations that define prison violence. Reinforced the code. Reggie had warned Tom, given him multiple chances to back down, only fought when Tom refused to apologize. This showed Reggie was fair, but unforgiving, would give you an opportunity to avoid violence, but once violence started, would end it decisively. Reggie's twin brother Ronald was also at Parkhurst in 1976. The twins were housed in different wings, but saw each other regularly during recreation periods and at meals. When Ronnie heard about the fight with Tom Morrison, and he heard about it within an hour of it happening, his reaction was immediate pride. According to another prisoner who was present when Ronnie learned about the fight, Ronnie said, "That's my brother. That's my twin. You insult our mother, you pay the price. Size doesn't matter. Tom learned that. Everyone learned that. And now no one will make that mistake again." Ronnie wanted to confront Tom himself when Tom returned from the hospital. Wanted to send an additional message. But Reggie told him no. Told him the message had been sent. Tom had been dealt with. No need for additional violence. This showed another dimension of Reggie's character. He wasn't interested in excessive violence. Wasn't interested in prolonged punishment. Just in swift, decisive responses to disrespect. Once the response was delivered, Once the message was sent, the matter was over. The twins' relationship with their mother was central to their identities. Violet Kray had raised them in poverty in East London, had stood by them through their criminal careers, had visited them in prison regularly, had never abandoned them despite their crimes. Both twins loved her absolutely, and both would kill to defend her honor. The fight with Tom Morrison was just one example, but it was the most dramatic, the most public, the one that became legend, because witnesses saw a 320-pound man destroyed in 15 seconds by someone half his size, all because he'd made a comment about the Kray twins' mother. The guards at Parkhurst knew what had happened in the exercise yard on March 23, 1976. Knew Reggie had beaten Tom. Knew why. But they couldn't officially acknowledge it because no witnesses would confirm it. One guard, speaking anonymously in a 1985 interview years after retiring, said, "Everyone knew Reggie destroyed Tom Morrison. Everyone knew it was because Tom had insulted Mrs. Kray. But not one prisoner would testify to it. Not one would confirm what happened. That's the code. Prison business stays prison business. Guards don't get involved unless absolutely necessary." The guard continued, "And honestly, most of us thought Tom had it coming. You don't insult a man's mother, especially not a man like Reggie Kray, who'd killed people on the outside for lesser offenses. Tom was stupid, thought his size would protect him. Learned the hard way that size means nothing against someone who knows how to fight." The guards at Parkhurst developed a policy after the incident. They informally warned new prisoners about the Kray twins. Told them, not officially but in private conversations, that the twins were to be left alone. That challenging them was suicide. That insulting their mother was a death wish. This wasn't official policy. Wasn't written down anywhere. But it was passed from guard to guard. A practical recognition that maintaining peace in Parkhurst required acknowledging the prisoner hierarchy and the specific lines you didn't cross. The fight between Reggie Kray and Big Tom Morrison became one of the most famous prison incidents in British history. The story was told and retold, embellished, exaggerated, but the core truth remained. A 320-pound man insulted Reggie Kray's mother. 15 seconds later, he was on the ground, broken and bleeding. The incident demonstrated several things about Reggie Kray's character. Loyalty to family. Above all else, above his own safety, above prison rules, Reggie would defend his mother's honor. This loyalty was absolute, non-negotiable. Fighting skill. Reggie's boxing training and street fighting experience made him more dangerous than men twice his size. He understood angles, timing, vulnerable targets. Fought with precision rather than just aggression. Controlled violence. Reggie didn't kill Tom. Didn't permanently disable him. Just hurt him enough to send the message. This showed restraint combined with brutality. Calculated violence rather than uncontrolled rage. Prison politics. Reggie understood how to maintain status in prison. The fight wasn't just about defending his mother. It was about reinforcing his position at the top of the prisoner hierarchy. About ensuring no one would challenge the Kray name again. The story also became a cautionary tale. Guards told it to news. Prisoners told it to each other. The lesson was clear. Don't test the Kray twins. Don't challenge their status. And never, under any circumstances, say anything disrespectful about Violet Kray. In later years, after Reggie was released from prison in 2000, He was released on compassionate grounds due to terminal cancer and died just weeks later. Various people who'd been at Parkhurst in 1976 gave interviews about the incident. One prisoner said, "I was 20 feet away when it happened. Saw the whole thing." Reggie gave Tom multiple chances to apologize, multiple warnings. Tom didn't take them, thought he was tough. Then Reggie moved, and it was over before it started. I'd never seen anything like it. A big man destroyed by a smaller man in seconds. It was like watching a professional boxer fight an amateur. The skill difference was that obvious. Another prisoner said, "After that fight, nobody talked about the Krays disrespectfully. Nobody tested them. Nobody challenged their status." The message was sent and received, and Tom spent the rest of his time at Parkhurst as a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when you cross the wrong people. Violet Kray died on August 4th, 1982, at age 73. Both Reggie and Ronnie were given temporary release to attend her funeral, heavily guarded and in handcuffs, but they were there. It was the last time the twins would be outside prison walls together. At the funeral, Reggie reportedly said to another mourner, "Everything I did, every fight, every time I defended our family's honor, it was for her. She deserved respect. She deserved protection. And I made sure she had it. Always." The fight with Big Tom Morrison in 1976 was just one example of that protection. One moment where Reggie Kray demonstrated that defending his mother's honor was worth any consequence. Worth solitary confinement. Worth violence. Worth everything. Big Tom Morrison insulted Violet Kray on March the 23rd, 1976. 15 seconds later, he was unconscious on the ground. And for the rest of his life, Tom carried the memory of those 15 seconds. The memory of realizing, too late, that size means nothing. That reputation is everything. And that you never, ever insult a Kray twins' mother. 18 stones is 252 pounds. It is the weight of a large man, not tall, necessarily. Weight and height do not always come together, but large in the way that matters in the specific environment of a prison yard, where you cannot run, where the exits are controlled, where the population is small and the distances are short, and the audience is always present, and the hierarchy that determines whether a man's days are tolerable or otherwise is established not through paperwork or rank or any of the formal structures that the prison service operates by, but through the simple, brutal, ancient currency of physical dominance. In a prison yard, 18 stones is a statement. It says, "I am the largest thing in this space. I am the thing you calculate around. I am the variable that changes the mathematics of any situation I enter." Terry Duggan understood this. He had been large since he was 15 years old, had been using it since he was 17. He was 34 years old in the autumn of 1970 and had been inside HMP Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight for 14 months on a grievous bodily harm conviction that his barrister had reduced, through considerable effort, from something that would have been worse. He was not, by Parkhurst standards, among the most dangerous men in the building. He was not the most intelligent. He was not the most connected. But he was 18 stones, and he was known, within the specific social ecosystem of Parkhurst's wings and yards, as a man who used that weight freely and without much hesitation. He had survived 14 months at Parkhurst substantially on the basis of that reputation. On the morning of a Tuesday in October 1970, Terry Duggan walked into the exercise yard at Parkhurst and did something that the weight of him and the 14 months of unchallenged reputation that weight had bought him had apparently convinced him he could do without consequence. He crossed the yard to where Ronnie Kray was standing, and he spat at him. What happened in the 5 minutes that followed was witnessed by every man in the yard that morning, perhaps 40 prisoners, plus the officers stationed at the perimeter. What it produced, beyond the immediate and graphic consequences for Terry Duggan personally, was a shift in the social architecture of HMP Parkhurst that the prison service officially did not acknowledge, and that every man inside the building understood completely. This is the story of what happened in the yard. This is the story of why it happened, and what kind of man it happened to, and why the 5 minutes that followed were not, despite what the size differential between the two men suggested to anyone watching, even close. The story of what Ronnie Kray's presence inside the prison system actually meant to the people who ran it and the people who lived inside it, and the story of what it meant in a world where the ordinary rules and protections and social contracts of the outside no longer applied, to have made the specific, irreversible mistake of spitting at the most dangerous man in the building. To understand what Ronnie Kray was in the autumn of 1970, you need to understand what 18 months in the prison system would and had not done to him. He had been convicted in May 1969, sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommended minimum of 20 years. He was 35 years old. He had been transferred, following processing at Brixton, to Parkhurst, the maximum security prison on the Isle of Wight that housed the most serious offenders in the English prison system, the men whose crimes or whose reputations or whose potential for disruption placed them in a category that required the specific insularity of island geography. The Isle of Wight arrangement was deliberate, not just for security, though security was the stated reason. The island created a practical obstacle to the informal networks of loyalty and enforcement that men like Ronnie Kray depended on outside. On the mainland, the Kray organization's reach had been demonstrated repeatedly, witnesses silenced, police contacts managed, information flowing through networks that the Metropolitan Police had spent years trying to map and never entirely succeeded. On an island, with a ferry crossing standing between the prisoner and any practical support, those networks were attenuated. Attenuated, not severed, because the thing that the prison service had calculated for and the thing it had not fully calculated for were two different things. What it had calculated for, the physical Ronnie Kray, the man of the outside world who could make calls and send people and maintain the machinery of the Kray organization's reach. What it had not fully calculated for, the Ronnie Kray who existed entirely within himself, who did not need a phone or a lieutenant or a network to be exactly what he had always been, whose presence in any enclosed space, any room, any corridor, any yard, produced in the people around him the same effect it had always produced, not because of anything he did, but because of what he was. The paranoid schizophrenia that had shadowed Ronnie for years was, inside Parkhurst, both more visible and more managed than it had been during the active years of the firm. More visible because the prison environment, its confinements, its routines, its specific social pressures, exacerbated the symptoms in ways that the relative freedom of the outside, the constant movement and activity, and social stimulation had sometimes masked. More managed because Parkhurst's medical staff, who were not unintelligent people, understood quickly that a medicated Ronnie Kray was a Parkhurst that functioned, and unmedicated Ronnie Kray was a Parkhurst that did not. The medication was maintained, but medication managed the schizophrenia. It did not change who Ronnie Kray was. It did not reduce the quality, the specific, undiluted, impossible to simulate quality that had made him what he was for 35 years. It did not make him easier to be around, or less likely to recognize disrespect, or less certain about what disrespect required in response. It kept him functional. Functional Ronnie Kray, inside Parkhurst in 1970, was still the most dangerous man in the building. Every senior officer knew this. Every wing governor knew this. Every prisoner who had been at Parkhurst for more than a month knew this, because the social information that moves through a prison population does so with a speed and completeness that makes any official communication system look slow. You knew who you were sharing a yard with. You knew what that meant. You adjusted accordingly. Most people adjusted accordingly. Terry Dugan had been at Parkhurst for 14 months. He knew who Ronnie Kray was. This is the fact that makes what he did in the yard that Tuesday morning difficult to fully account for, and that the various people who were present and who described it in the years afterward found themselves returning to repeatedly. Not, how could you not know? Everyone knew. But, knowing, how do you do it anyway? The most coherent explanation, assembled from the accounts of men who knew Dugan and who had spent enough time around him to understand his operating logic, was this. Dugan's 18 years of managing through size had produced in him a specific blind spot. He had spent so long as the largest, heaviest, most physically imposing man in whatever room he was in that he had come to treat his own weight as a kind of universal answer to questions about power. Had you a problem with someone, you were large enough to make it their problem. Instead, was someone occupying social space that you wanted? Your size was the argument that relocated them. This logic had worked for 18 years across a range of environments: secondary school, youth offending institutions, the pubs and estates of southeast London where he'd operated, the first 14 months of Parkhurst. It had never catastrophically failed him. He had never been in the same yard as Ronnie Kray before. Not specifically Ronnie. Dugan had also never been in the same yard as a number of other people whose names appear in the history of this period. His operational universe, until October 1970, had not intersected at close range with anyone for whom his weight was insufficient preparation. He had also, in the weeks before the morning in question, been having difficulties. Prison difficulties. The specific, enclosed, grinding kind that arise from territorial disputes within the population, from perceived slights that accumulate without resolution in a world where you cannot simply leave, from the pressure of an environment that offers no release and no perspective. He had been, by the accounts of people on his wing, wound tight, irritable, looking in the way that wound. Tight men in prison look for something to discharge against. What drew his attention to Ronnie Kray specifically is not entirely clear. What is clear is that on that Tuesday morning in October 1970, Dugan walked into the yard during the morning exercise period, crossed the concrete to where Ronnie was standing near the far wall. Ronnie stood near walls in yards as a matter of established practice, back to the brick, the whole space visible, and stopped in front of him. He said something. The accounts of what he said differ slightly. The consensus is that it was short, and it was contemptuous, and it was delivered in the particular tone of a man who had decided he was making a statement and wanted everyone in the yard to know he was making it. Then he spat, not accidentally, not a nervous reflex or an involuntary gesture that could be reframed later as something other than what it was, deliberately, at Ronnie's face, in a prison yard, in front of 40 men. Spitting is not, in the abstract, the worst thing one person can do to another. In the specific context of a prison yard, in 1970, in front of 40 men, for whom the entire social architecture of their daily survival rests on the question of where each person stands in relation to every other person. It is close. It is not a challenge in the way that a thrown punch is a challenge. A punch says, "I want to fight you." You have the option of fighting back or not fighting back. And both options are legible and carry their own respective meanings in the hierarchy. Spitting says something different. It says, "You are not worth fighting. You are below the threshold at which I treat you as an equal adversary. I will not dignify you with violence. I will simply express my contempt for you in the most direct and degrading form available." In a prison environment, where every transaction between men is observed and catalogued and assigned meaning by an audience with nothing else to do all day, this is understood by everyone present. The man who is spat at has a window, a narrow one. What happens in the next few seconds determines not just this moment, but every subsequent moment, every interaction, every negotiation, every morning in the yard, for as long as both men are inside the same building. Ronnie Kray had been in front of audiences his entire adult life. He understood in the marrow of him what this moment required. He did not move immediately. This was the first thing the witnesses noted. Not the fighting. When it came, the fighting was expected, however it went. What stayed with people was the moment before. The stillness. A man had just spat at Ronnie Kray in the yard at Parkhurst. And Ronnie stood where he was and looked at Dugan and did not move. 3 seconds, perhaps 5, long enough that at least 2 of the men watching thought for a moment that something unprecedented was about to happen, that Ronnie was going to absorb it, walk away, let it be what it was, that the medication or the years or some calculation they couldn't see was going to produce a response that changed everything anyone knew about who Ronnie Kray was. They were wrong. What the stillness was, as understood by people who knew Ronnie well enough to read it, including a man on his wing who had known him since before the arrests and who described the morning in detail years later, was not hesitation, was not calculation in the sense of a man working out whether to act. It was the stillness of a man who had already decided completely and was taking one breath before the decision became physical. Ronnie hit Dugan once. The specifics of the blow, where it landed, the exact mechanics of it, are described differently by different witnesses in the way that fast violence is always described differently by people watching from different angles under conditions of sudden shock. What the accounts agree on is the outcome. Dugan went down, not staggered, not reeled, down. The specific collapse of a man whose legs have been removed from the conversation without consultation. Dugan was 18 stones. Ronnie was 5 feet 8 inches and weighed perhaps 13 stone in 1970. Heavier than his younger years, less fit than he'd been when he was boxing as a teenager, and a young man but still carrying, in the shoulders and the chest, and the particular economy of a man who had been fighting since adolescence, the accumulated physical intelligence of 35 years. The size difference was not what most of the watching men had expected it to be. What followed, what constituted the 5 minutes the title refers to, was not a sustained assault in the sense of prolonged, methodical violence. Ronnie was not the type for prolonged and methodical, outside of context where prolonged and methodical served a specific strategic purpose. What he was is total. When Ronnie Kray decided something needed to happen, the entirety of him went into it, without reserve, without the moderation that most men apply even in serious violence, because some part of them is always watching the situation and calibrating. Ronnie did not calibrate. The officers intervened. The timeline, from the spit to the moment the officers reached them, was somewhere between 3 and 6 minutes, depending on which account you were reading. The yard at Parkhurst was large enough that officers stationed at the perimeter could not cover it instantly. And the first moments of what they were watching were ambiguous enough. Men crowding in that specific way that crowds form around prison violence, obscuring the sightlines. That the response took the time it took. By the time the officers arrived and separated them, Terry Dugan required medical attention. Ronnie Kray required nothing. He was breathing harder than he had been. That was it. He was returned to his wing. He was not immediately placed in solitary. The official thinking on Ronnie Kray and solitary confinement at Parkhurst had evolved through his early months there toward the conclusion that solitary, for a man with Ronnie's psychiatric history, produced outcomes that were more difficult to manage than the alternatives. He was returned to his wing, and the morning continued. And by the afternoon, the yard had processed what it had seen, and the conclusions being drawn from it were moving through the population with the inevitable speed of information in a closed system. The conclusions were not complicated. A man who was 18 stones and had operated on the basis of that weight for 18 years had crossed a yard at Parkhurst and spat at Ronnie Kray. And Ronnie Kray, who was 5 inches shorter and 5 stones lighter, had put him on the ground. What the population of Parkhurst made of this was not shock at Ronnie's capabilities. His reputation had preceded him into the building and continued to be confirmed at regular intervals. It was something more specific. It was the confirmation, made visible in the most public possible way, that the category of man who could reasonably believe himself exempt from Ronnie's response did not exist. There was no size that was sufficient. There was no weight that changed the mathematics. The 18 stones that had been Terry Dugan's universal answer to questions about power had in the space of 5 minutes been demonstrated to be a factor that Ronnie Kray did not include in his calculations. For the men in that yard, some of whom were large, some of whom had operated on similar logic in their own ways, all of whom were watching and processing, this was a piece of information that had immediate practical application. Dugan spent 4 days in the prison medical wing. His injuries were documented in medical records that would not be released publicly and which are known only through accounts given by people with access to them. What was observed by men on his wing when he returned was that he was quieter than he had been, that the specific quality of territorial assertion that had characterized his first 14 months at Parkhurst was gone, or at minimum substantially reduced, that he walked through the building with the careful peripheral awareness of a man who has revised his understanding of where he stands. He served the remainder of his sentence without incident. He was released in 1973 and returned, by the accounts of people who encountered him afterward, to a life in southeast London that was notably lower in profile than what had preceded his imprisonment. Not reformed exactly, not the language of official rehabilitation, simply smaller, quieter, a man who had learned something expensive and appeared to have learned it thoroughly. He was never asked about the morning in the yard in any public context. He did not discuss it. This itself was noted by men who had been there. The yard incident was the kind of event that men who emerge from it intact usually discuss. It becomes part of the currency of prison narrative, the shared property of everyone who witnessed it, the story that gets refined and retold across years of subsequent imprisonment and release. Dugan's silence on the subject was specific, not the silence of modesty or discretion, the silence of a man who has no interest in revisiting a morning he would prefer to have happened differently and cannot change. The prison service's official response to the incident was the response the prison service gave to most incidents involving Ronnie Kray. It was documented. It was filed. It produced a report that went upward through the relevant administrative channels and was received by people who read it and noted it and placed it in a growing body of documentation that collectively described a management problem without a satisfying solution. The problem was this: HMP Parkhurst existed to contain Ronnie Kray. It did this. He did not escape. He did not orchestrate anything from inside that reached the level of a serious external operation. In the physical and security sense, Parkhurst performed its function. What it could not do, what no prison the service had available could do, was contain what Ronnie Kray was, which was not a set of actions, not a network of contacts, not a capability that could be restricted through the removal of phone access or controlled visiting arrangements. It was a presence, a quality, something that existed in a room or a yard or a wing entirely independently of what Ronnie did, and that could not be managed by any of the tools the prison service had developed for managing men. The governor at Parkhurst during this period was later asked, in an interview conducted after his retirement, about the challenge of managing Ronnie Kray. His answer was careful in the way that career civil servants learn to be careful in retirement, honest in shape without being specific in detail. He was unlike anyone else we held, the governor said. You can build a prison for a man's body. You can design a regime for his behavior. What you cannot do is design a regime for what he represents to everyone around him. The other prisoners knew who he was before they arrived. Some of them had arranged their entire criminal careers around either avoiding the Kray firm or trying to be associated with it. You couldn't simply walk them into a yard with him and expect normal dynamics. He paused. The Dugan incident was not, in our view, instigated by Kray. He was the one spat at. In any normal situation involving any other prisoner, the provocation would have been significant mitigation. With Kray, the situation was not normal. He never was. Ronnie Kray remained at Parkhurst until 1979. 9 years in the same building, 9 years in the same yards and the same wings and the same medical arrangements and the same regulated distance from the outside world. 9 years during which the management of him became so embedded in the institution's operational understanding that new officers were briefed on it specifically, not as a rule, not written into any formal document, but passed on in the informal way that institutions convey their real operating knowledge, from experienced staff to inexperienced ones. You don't provoke Kray. You manage around him. You ensure that the people who are likely to misread the situation are not in the same immediate space as him without adequate preparation. You do not make the mistake of assuming that his size, or his age, or his medication, or the years he has served have changed what happens when someone crosses a line that he has decided cannot be crossed. He was transferred to Broadmoor in 1979, where the framework was psychiatric rather than correctional, where the question was not how to contain a criminal, but how to treat a man who was genuinely ill and had been genuinely ill for a long time and needed a context that could address that. He was 55 years old when he died at Broadmoor in March 1995. He had been inside some institution or other for more than 26 of his 61 years. The exercise yard at Parkhurst, where the morning of October 1970 took place, is concrete and enclosed, and not significantly different now from how it looked then. The building is still a functioning prison. The yard is still used. There is nothing in it to mark what happened there. No record on the wall. No reference in any official account of the institution's history. But the men who were in the yard that morning, the 40 or so who watched from various distances as an 18-stone man crossed the concrete and spat at Ronnie Kray, and discovered, in the following 5 minutes, the specific and comprehensive nature of his error. Those men carried it with them, talked about it in other institutions in the years of subsequent imprisonment that some of them served, talked about it after release, in the pubs and the flats, and the various contexts in which the men of that world talked about the things they'd seen. Not because the violence was the worst they'd witnessed. The violence was not the worst they'd witnessed. Parkhurst in 1970 contained men who had done things considerably worse than what Ronnie Kray did to Terry Duggan in 5 minutes in the yard. They talked about it because of the stillness before it, the seconds between the spit and the response. Ronnie standing where he was, not moving, while an 18-stone man's contempt hung in the air between them, and every man in the yard stopped breathing and waited to find out what the world was about to show them. One of the witnesses, speaking about it decades later, said it was the most frightening thing he ever saw inside a prison. Not the fighting, the stillness. You could see it, he said, in his face. He'd already decided. He was just letting you know there was a moment before he did it, that he was choosing to do it, not losing his temper, not reacting, choosing. He stopped. That's what scared you, that it was a choice. The door was unlocked at 4:15 in the afternoon. Not broken, not forced, not cut through or blown open or overwhelmed by any of the methods that prison escape stories generally depend on. Unlocked by a member of staff at a prearranged time on a prearranged day, in the full knowledge of what the unlocking meant and for whom. The door was a gate in the perimeter of a working farm adjacent to HMP Dartmoor in Devon. Dartmoor, the prison that sits on the high moorland of southwest England, in the middle of one of the most inhospitable landscapes in the country, where the wind comes off the moor in winter with a coldness that feels personal, where the fog settles so completely that the building seems to exist in its own separate atmosphere, disconnected from everything else. The prison had been built in 1809 to hold Napoleonic prisoners of war. By December 1966, it had been holding people the British state considered its most serious problems for 157 years. It was not a building from which people simply walked away. On the afternoon of December 12, 1966, Frank Mitchell walked away. He was 32 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, somewhere between 18 and 20 stones, depending on the season and how much he had been eating, which at Dartmoor was considerably more than the standard allocation, because the prison authorities had made various accommodations for Frank Mitchell over the years in the interest of keeping him manageable. He walked through the unlocked gate in the farm perimeter and into a car that was waiting on the lane outside. 2 men in the car, Kray people. They drove north and east toward London. Frank Mitchell, who was serving a sentence with no fixed release date, an indefinite sentence, the specific cruelty of which was that it offered no endpoint, no date to count toward, no morning that could be circled on a calendar, was free. He had been free for 11 days when the Krays realized they had made a mistake they could not fix. He had been free for 12 days when the mistake became irreversible. This is the story of what the Krays did when they broke Frank Mitchell out of Dartmoor, and what Frank Mitchell did when he discovered that freedom was not what he had been imagining it would be from the inside of a prison cell. The story of a man so extreme in every dimension, in his size, in his capacity for violence, in the specific and desperate quality of his loneliness, that even the organization that had arranged his escape found him within a fortnight, not a trophy, but a crisis. And the story of what happened in a flat in Barking in December 1966, which the law spent years trying to prove, and which the men who knew what happened never fully admitted, and which ended one of the strangest episodes in the history of British organized crime in the only way it was ever going to end. To understand Frank Mitchell, you need to understand what kind of man the prison system had spent 15 years failing to contain or correct. Francis Maximilian Mitchell was born in 1929 in East London. He was from the beginning too large for the environments he was placed in. Not metaphorically, literally. He grew fast and kept growing in the way that some people do, past the point where it stops and at a rate that the world around him found difficult to accommodate. By his mid-teens, he was physically the size of an adult man. By his late teens, he was larger than most adult men he encountered. He was not intelligent in the conventional sense. He had not been well schooled. His early life had not provided the conditions in which conventional intelligence is developed and expressed. What he had was a specific, direct, physical intelligence about the world, an understanding of space and bodies, and the relationships between them that very large people sometimes develop because their size means that every room they enter has to be renegotiated. He also had, from early in his life, episodes. The word available in the 1940s and 1950s for what Frank Mitchell experienced was not the word that would be available now. What would now be a clinical description of a specific condition, an inability to regulate emotional responses past a certain threshold, producing in extreme situations an intensity of behavior that the people around him could not manage, and that Frank himself, afterward, could not fully account for, was described then in the language of moral failure. He was uncontrollable. He was dangerous. He was bad. He was first imprisoned at 16. By his early 20s, he had accumulated a record that the courts found, each time they looked at it, sufficient reason to extend his time inside rather than release him. not always because the most recent offense demanded it, but because the accumulation demanded it, because the picture that emerged from Frank Mitchell's file was of a man for whom the outside world had never developed adequate arrangements, and toward whom the inside world had developed no adequate response either. He was sent to Broadmoor at one point in the 1950s. He escaped. He was found in a nearby house where he had broken in and taken a family briefly hostage, and where he was found by police to be sitting at the kitchen table, having a cup of tea with the family, in the particular bewildered calm of a man who had done something extreme and now wasn't sure what came next. The hostage family later described him as polite. He was sent back to Broadmoor. He escaped again. He was eventually reclassified and sent to conventional prison, where the consensus of the medical and penal establishment was that he was not primarily a psychiatric case, not in the way that required the specific environment of a secure hospital, but a case of such extreme dangerousness that the normal frameworks of imprisonment did not quite fit him either. The courts resolved this problem with the tool available, an indefinite sentence. You will be imprisoned until we are satisfied that you are safe to release. There is no date. There is no endpoint. There is just the ongoing assessment, renewed indefinitely, that Frank Mitchell was not safe to release. He received this sentence in 1962. He was 28 years old. The Dartmoor arrangements that preceded the December escape were the product of several years of a specific practical negotiation between Frank Mitchell and the prison authorities. Mitchell, inside Dartmoor, needed managing. This was understood by everyone who worked there. A man of his size and his history and his particular relationship with rules and confinement could not simply be processed through the standard regime. He would break it, not deliberately, not with strategic intent, but because the standard regime was built for men whose dimensions, physical and psychological, are within certain parameters. Mitchell's didn't. The accommodations were various. Extra food, more physical activity, work assignments that kept him outdoors and occupied. Specifically on the farm, work that gave him space and movement that the wings did not. A latitude in certain informal social arrangements, visits to local pubs in the Dartmoor area with prison officers, a practice that sounds extraordinary in retrospect, and was extraordinary in prospect, but which had evolved as a practical solution to the problem of keeping Mitchell calm. He went to pubs with officers on the moor. He was within these accommodations genuinely manageable. Not safe. The officers who accompanied him understood perfectly well that if the accommodations stopped being sufficient, what came next was not manageable in the same way, but manageable. He was also, within Dartmoor, a figure of specific social significance. His reputation had preceded him through the prison system for 15 years. Other prisoners understood what he was, and what he was produced in most of them, the instinctive, appropriate response that extreme physical presence, combined with extreme unpredictability always produces. They were careful around him. The Krays heard about Frank Mitchell through the ordinary channels of information that connected the various parts of London's criminal world to the prison system, which were more direct and more functional than the prison service liked to acknowledge. They heard about his situation, the indefinite sentence, the no fixed release date arrangement, the specific injustice as it appeared from Mitchell's perspective, and as it was framed in the conversations he had with anyone who would listen. The injustice framing was Frank Mitchell's own, and it was genuine. He had committed serious crimes. He did not dispute this. What he disputed, what he believed, with a sincerity and an intensity that the people around him at Dartmoor found both credible and exhausting, was that the indefinite sentence was fundamentally different from a sentence with a term. That the absence of a release date was not a proportionate response to what he had done, but a permanent removal of the hope that human beings need to function. That what was being done to him was not punishment, which he could accept, but erasure, which he could not. He talked about this constantly. To officers, to other prisoners, to anyone who came within conversational range. The Krays had associates who passed through Dartmoor. Those associates came back with Mitchell's conversation, with his case as he presented it, with the impression, and this was the impression that the associates conveyed, and that the Krays received, and that drove what followed, of a man whose fundamental decency, however obscured by history and circumstance, and the episodes that his file described, was genuine, who had been treated unjustly, who deserved to have someone do something. Ronnie Kray decided to do something. The logic behind the escape, as reconstructed from what was said at various times by various people connected to the Kray organization, went like this. Mitchell needed a release date. The prison service would not give him one through normal channels. What was required was pressure, public pressure, the kind that could be applied if Mitchell's case were known about, if a newspaper published his situation, and the public responded in the way the public sometimes responded to stories of manifest injustice. If a man with no release date, serving indefinitely for crimes that were serious but not uniquely so, could be presented to the British public as a specific and legible victim of a specific and legible wrong. The plan was for Mitchell to be extracted from Dartmoor, to be sheltered in London while a letter was written, a letter in Mitchell's own words, to a newspaper, making his case, and for the letter to produce the public response that produced the official response that produced the release date that Mitchell could then return to prison to serve out. It will, as plans go, considerably more complex in its dependencies than it was in its statement. It required public opinion to move in a particular direction. It required the newspaper to publish. It required the Home Office to respond. It required Mitchell, who had never in his life been the subject of a planned public relations exercise, and who had no experience of any of the institutions the plan depended on, to sit quietly in a flat in London and wait for a process he couldn't see or touch or influence to resolve itself in his favor. That last requirement was where the plan failed. The flat was in Barking, East London. A ground floor flat, chosen for its ordinariness. The street was residential, the building unremarkable, the neighbors not the kind who looked at what was happening around them with any particular attention. Mitchell was brought there the evening of December 12th. The Krays had arranged everything: food, drink, company, specifically a woman named Lisa, who had been brought in to keep Mitchell comfortable, the thinking being that a man who had been inside for years, and who was now free in a flat in London, would be made manageable by female company. Lisa, in accounts she gave much later, described the situation with a directness that left nothing to interpretation. She had been told what was needed, and she had agreed to provide it. What she had not been told was what Frank Mitchell was, in the specific sense of what it would be like to be in a room with him and responsible for keeping him calm. He was, she said, surprisingly gentle with her. She was specific about this. He was not what she had expected from the description. He was in the context of the flat and the evenings they spent together, not a frightening man. He was a desperate one. He wanted to know from the first evening where his letter was, whether it had been written, whether it had been sent, whether the newspaper had it, what the response was. He asked these questions every day, multiple times a day, with an increasing urgency that had nothing irrational in it. He was in a flat in Barking, with no freedom of movement, dependent entirely on people he had known for a fortnight, waiting for a process he couldn't observe to produce an outcome he needed. The letter had been written. It went to the Times. Albert Donahue, a Kray associate, helped Mitchell write it in the voice required, articulate, measured, the case presented without aggression. It was sent. The response was not what the plan required. Not nothing. The Mitchell situation was known about quickly enough through the information systems of the Metropolitan Police, who had been briefed by Dartmoor the morning after the escape, and who understood within a day or two where Mitchell probably was, even if they couldn't immediately prove it. The newspaper, navigating the legal complications of knowingly publishing a letter from a man who was the subject of a national manhunt, moved carefully and slowly. The public response, when pieces of the story began to appear in the press, was not the tide of sympathy the plan had predicted. Frank Mitchell, the mad axeman, escapee from Dartmoor, the frame the newspapers used was not the frame of a man unjustly detained. It was the frame his record produced. The pressure the Krays had planned to create did not materialize. Inside the flat, Mitchell was beginning to come apart, not violently, not immediately, but the specific quality that had made him unmanageable for 15 years, the inability to absorb an absence of resolution past a certain point, the threshold beyond which the waiting became intolerable, and the intolerable produced the episodes that his file described, was becoming visible in the flat in Barking in ways that the people managing him found increasingly difficult to contain. He wanted to go out. He was told he couldn't. He wanted to go and speak to the Krays directly. He was told to wait. He wanted to know what was happening. He was told things were progressing. He asked the same questions again the next morning and the morning after. He wrote another letter, this one to the Home Secretary, demanding a reply. The letter was dictated to Donahue with an intensity that everyone present found alarming, not the words, which were again measured and clear, but the desperation beneath them, visible in the way Mitchell sat at the table, and the way he stopped between sentences, and the way he looked at the people around him while he was composing it. He had been in the flat for a week. He began to talk about leaving, not escaping in the sense of running from the Krays. He had no grievance with them, or not yet. Leaving in the sense of simply walking out of the flat and finding the Krays himself, and making the conversation happen that the intermediaries and the letters and the plan were failing to make happen. He talked about this in the escalating way that Frank Mitchell talked about things he had decided, with a growing certainty that was not aggressive in its tone, but absolute in its direction. He was the largest, strongest, most physically dangerous man in any room he occupied. If Frank Mitchell decided to leave the flat, the people in the flat could not stop him. The Krays understood this. What the escape had produced, the thing the plan had not fully modeled, was not a grateful, manageable man waiting patiently for his situation to resolve. It was Frank Mitchell, in a flat in Barking, growing daily more certain that patience was not working and that he needed to take things into his own hands. The Krays' situation, looked at from the outside, was this. They had broken a man out of one of Britain's most secure prisons. The police were looking for him. The police were looking for the people who had helped him. Every day Mitchell was free was another day of exposure. Every day he grew more restless was another day on which the controlled situation they had designed could become uncontrolled in ways that produced consequences none of the planning had accounted for. They had wanted Mitchell out because he was a powerful man, wrongly confined, and because the getting of him out demonstrated the reach of the Kray organization in a way that the firm's reputation benefited from. They had not fully reckoned with what Mitchell's freedom would require of them, not the organization. The organization could absorb it. What freedom required of Mitchell specifically, the resolution, the answer, the proof that it had been worth it, was something the Krays could not provide. Because the process they had staked everything on had not worked and was not going to work, and the Home Office was not going to issue a release date for a man serving an indefinite sentence who had just demonstrated, by escaping from Dartmoor with criminal assistance, that the concerns which had produced the indefinite sentence were, if anything, understated. The plan was finished. Mitchell did not know the plan was finished. On December 23, 1966, 11 days after the escape, Frank Mitchell was taken from the flat in Barking. He was told he was being moved to somewhere safer, to somewhere he would have more room. He was told things were progressing, and that the move was part of the progression. He got into a van. The van left barking. Frank Mitchell was never seen again. What happened in the van on December 23, 1966, was the subject of a criminal trial in 1969. It was alleged that Mitchell was shot inside the van by a man named Freddie Foreman, acting on behalf of the Kray organization. Foreman, who was tried alongside the Kray twins for Mitchell's murder, was acquitted. The Kray twins were also acquitted of the Mitchell murder, separately from their convictions for the Cornell and McVitie killings. The acquittals were the result of insufficient evidence. The nature of what had happened in the van, if it had happened in the way alleged, had left no physical evidence that could be placed before a jury. And the witnesses the prosecution depended on were witnesses of the particular kind that the Kray trials throughout produced. People who had been inside the world, who knew what they knew, and whose willingness to say it was conditioned by calculations that made their testimony fragile. Frank Mitchell's body was never found. He joined Jack McVitie in the category of Kray-connected deaths that the legal system acknowledged in principle and could not fully prosecute in practice. Two men, both gone, neither found, both known. Freddie Foreman, in a 1996 interview, said something that had not been said publicly before. He said that he had been present when Frank Mitchell died. He did not, in that interview, use the word killed. He said Mitchell had died. He said the manner of it. He said it the way a man says something he has decided to say after 30 years of not saying it. He was not prosecuted on the basis of the interview. The statute of limitations, the lack of a body, the absence of physical evidence, the passage of time. The law had no viable path. The interview stood as testimony of the particular kind that doesn't produce a verdict. Albert Donahue, who had spent more time with Mitchell in the Barking Flat than almost anyone else during those 11 days, described him in accounts given over many years with a consistency that suggested genuine recollection rather than constructed narrative. He said Mitchell was the saddest person he had ever been in a room with. Not frightening, though he was frightening, in the way that something enormously powerful and not fully in control of itself is frightening. Not the monster of the newspapers. Not the mad axeman, in the sense the tabloids had assembled that figure from the file and the nickname, Sad. A man who had been in one institution or another since he was 16 years old. Who had not, in any sustained way, lived a life outside those institutions. Who had organized everything, his hopes, his correspondence, his letters to newspapers and home secretaries, his conversations with anyone who would listen, around a single specific desire. Not freedom in the abstract, not the generalized wish of every imprisoned man to be somewhere else, a date, a fixed point in the future, a morning that had been chosen and confirmed, and that he could count toward. He had never been given that. He had been given 11 days in a flat in Barking, and a woman named Lisa, who was kind to him, and the daily diminishing hope that a letter had started a process that would end with what he needed. Then he had been put in a van. The letter to the Times was never published in the circumstances Mitchell had imagined. It appeared in the press, eventually, as an exhibit in the trial. Evidence of the planning, the communication, the conspiracy. Read in that context rather than the one it was written for. The argument it made. For a man whose crime and whose punishment had parted company went unaddressed. There was no release date. There was no response from the Home Office. There was no morning that had been circled on a calendar. There was a flat in Barking and a van on December 23rd. And then 30 years of silence broken by an interview and the permanent, unresolved absence of a body anywhere anyone has ever looked. The door at Dartmoor that was unlocked at 4:15 on December 12, 1966, was relocked within the hour. Frank Mitchell never went back through it. He never went anywhere they could find